Yes.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Helle Jorgensen. I'm from the University of Birmingham, and with me today I have Dr. Predencia Dixon, a very freshly minted PhD from our program in cultural heritage. We're having this interview, although we're doing it a little bit early to facilitate Predencia's way out on the conference trail in the autumn in honor of Black History Month in October. And 2023 is also the 75th anniversary year of Windrush. Predencia's dissertation on Jamaican heritage and identity crisis in response to changing death rituals, which is based on ethnographic studies carried out both in Jamaica and in the UK, speak to both of these historical contexts. But actually, Predencia, your research started out with interest in a completely different aspect of Black history. Can you tell us how you started out on your research trajectory and what made you change your plans?
Okay. So I in 2013 I did a DNA test because I'm Jamaican and of diaspora of Africa and the descendant of slaves. I didn't really know where my ancestry in Africa was, so I did a DNA test which placed me in with the Tikar people of Cameroon. So I went out and met with them and did some voluntary work, did some fundraising for a project I worked in. And in 2017 I went back to visit, and I was given a royal title. I was made a Yah with the Nsong people of Cameroon. And as part of my gift back to them, I offered to write a book about the customs and practices and titling customs of the Nsong people. And they said, yes, that would be great. But I thought if I was registered for a PhD, it would give me greater access to the resources that I would need. And that's what I did. I registered with Birmingham University with yourselves and Dr. John Carman. And within a couple of weeks of being on the program, the civil disobedience that had been rumbling in Cameroon for some years descended into civil war, and it was pointed out to me that Birmingham could not send a student into a war zone. So if I wanted to stay on the program, I could either do the research somewhere else, but the Nsong people of Cameroon doesn't exist anywhere else, or I could find a different topic. And because I still wanted to complete the program, I was then forced to find another topic. And it was during the month I wandered around going, oh, woe is me, what am I going to do? And I became aware of a lot of rumblings within the Jamaican community in Birmingham about the changes in some of the Jamaican death rituals. There was sufficient there for me to because some of these linked with some of the practices in Africa. And I thought, well, maybe there could be a research project in this. And I consulted with yourselves and Dr. John Carman, and you said, write another proposal, and I did, and you said yes. So this is how I came to be working on Jamaican death rituals.
And so you found that there were concerns about changing death rituals amongst Jamaicans, both in the UK, in the diaspora, and in Jamaica. So how did you set out to study this?
Well, because very little was known about it, I decided to adopt a kind of interpretive philosophy for the research, and to adopt a qualitative strategy. It made sense to do a comparative case study using mixed methodology, and the methodology included semi-structured interviews, an element of which was oral history. Quite a bit of what what the research uncovered had never been recorded anywhere else. And I also used ethnographic observations in both the UK and in Jamaica.
And as though there hadn't been enough hiccups in your research trajectory, your research also happened to coincide with the COVID-19 pandemic and all the havoc that it wreaked. So how did that impact on your research, Predencia? You were studying death rituals, and all of a sudden you were doing it in the middle of a pandemic.
Well, it impacted massively. In some negative, but also some very positive ways. So as much of the data I was gathering involved contact with people, and one of the major restrictions of the COVID-19 pandemic was not interacting with people. So that impacted on the number of interviews I was able to do. I'd originally planned to do 120, and because of that lack of contact, I was only able to do 48. Also, the ethnographic observations were of public rituals, and of course there were no public rituals allowed. So the data collecting was very heavily impacted there as well. However, there were some mitigating factors in that the pandemic forced many families to use live streaming of particularly funerals, but also the burials as well. So I was able to actually observe 49 of the 50 public rituals that I had intended to observe, because I was able to observe some of them on live stream. Given that said, though, the data, because I had collected quite a lot of data from the UK, and I'd actually hit the ground running in Jamaica. I'd arrived on the 4th of February, and Jamaica went into lockdown on the 10th of March, but I'd actually conducted 18 interviews by then and had observed a number of public rituals. So there was sufficient data there to apply thematic analysis. And in analysing the data, I don't think many more interviews would have produced different outcomes, because there was actually quite a degree of data saturation with the data I'd already got.
In a sense, perhaps the pandemic also forced a lot of people to reflect about what's really crucially important in the rituals that they use to handle death. So do you think it brought anything to the forefront in terms of how your informants thought about the handling death?
Well, yes. There were a number of complaints about the fact that many people were just going to the rituals because there were meals. Almost all of the Jamaican death rituals involve food and drink and music. And there were grumblings that many people were only attending these events because there was going to be a party and there was going to be free food. And what actually happened, and I think it was an extremely good time to be doing this research, because had it not been this time, I wouldn't have been able to identify what was left when everything else was stripped away. So one of the things I found was, although there was a restriction on the numbers that could attend public rituals, such as funerals and burials. And I think in the UK, it was 20 or 30, and in Jamaica, it was a similar amount. hundreds of people would turn up outside of a church or a cemetery, knowing that they couldn't go in. And at one of them, but they would stand there with their mobile phones, live streaming what was going on inside the church. And I asked, well, couldn't you just live stream that at home? And the responses were, we could, but the family wouldn't know that we were here. And it became clear that what is at the core, and I don't think that it would have been possible to have identified this at any other time other than in this pandemic. What is actually at the core of the Jamaican death rituals is presence. It's important for people to be present at the events. And it was a revelation to me, because it was one of those surprises that it was a happy happenance, that I stumbled on this, because, as I said, if the pandemic hadn't happened, I wouldn't have discovered this. And so be able to dispel the myth that people only go to events because there is going to be free food. There were no free foods at these events.
So it's not just about material concerns and enjoyment, it's about a sense of community and fellowship and moral support.
Yes. Moral support, and particularly emotional and spiritual support. Yeah. That was very, very important to the community.
Yeah, and you've already started detailing a little bit what some of the concerns were and what some of the changes that people conceived were, but can you elaborate a little bit on what these concerns about changes and how death rituals of practice sort of made you pick up your attention to this field as worthwhile of study? What is it that people were so worried about?
Well, they were mainly worried about that these changes were really impacting on our heritage, that we were losing, that Jamaicans were losing a significant part of their heritage, because the way the rituals were being performed were not in line with how they should be. They were not conducive to the original practices, to the traditional practices, and so that tradition was being lost. And with the loss of that tradition was a loss of a significant part of our heritage. There were also concerns about that loss then being reflected in a loss of national identity. So if we can't identify these things as Jamaican, then Jamaicans, then who are we? So these were the initial concerns that that propelled me into digging deeper into the possibility of doing this research.
And can you tell a bit about what sort of rituals are and have been practiced amongst Jamaicans when handling death?
Okay, so Jamaican death rituals are kind of syncretism of European Christian religion and rituals and African rituals. So essentially then, there are funerals, burials, there's what's called a wake, and that wake can either apply to the sitting with the family the night before the funeral or to the meal after the burial. So there are those. These are the main public rituals. There is one ritual that has an African basis, but has no counterpart in the UK or in Christianity, and that is a 9-night. The nine night is the ritual that is most at risk, and that is probably one of the reasons, because it has no counterpart in the UK. And that then became the main focus of the study, and it's what actually gives it its name, death of the nine night. The main concerns are about the nine night. So the nine night traditionally marked the end of the grieving process. That was in the days when a body was buried within 3 days of death. And so the ninth night was marked the end of the grieving process, but it also marked, in the African tradition, the time when the deceased spirit became an ancestor. That's the African translation. There was another nuance layered onto that in Jamaica, being a diaspora of African slaves, that said on the ninth night was when the spirit of the deceased made its way back to Africa. It arrived back in Africa. So as you can see, there is no counterpart within the Christian religion. It very much acknowledges the presence of the ancestors in the lives of the bereaved. And the tensions around that rituals are to do with two main things. One is the fact that funerals now, or the disposal of the body, is no longer done within 3 days. So we've moved from 3 days to sometimes, quite often, between 4 and 8 weeks. So the nine night no longer marks the grieving process, the end of the grieving process. And in fact, is now conducted prior to the funeral. So the whole meaning of it has been lost. And this is one of the reasons that it is at risk of being lost, really. It is the one that is at greatest risk of extinction within the UK, because there are some deaths now where the nine night is not performed at all. Less so in Jamaica, where although the meaning is lost, the tradition is still strong. So the ritual goes on traditionally without the meaning, whereas in the UK, without the meaning, there's a greater risk of it being lost.
And what are the factors that contribute to these changes and potential loss in meaning?
Yeah, there were. I mean, this is one of the questions I asked the interviewees, and there were. I was able to identify 7 main reasons. Just let me make sure that I've got them identified properly. So we have acculturation, which is basically being exposed to different cultures. Then there was not teaching the rituals to children. And also there's the fact that the children are no longer, because of acculturation, children in the UK are not routinely taken to funerals, whereas they are very much so in Jamaica. So they are, that's one of the reasons. Technology was identified as one. More affluence within the community, so bigger and more extravagant funerals. Well, not just funerals, but all public rituals. Also, changing beliefs. Many of the rituals were originally designed for protection from the deceased. But because of changing beliefs, some of them are not being performed anymore because the belief is not in a retributive spirit anymore, but in a benign spiritual guide. The medicalization of death. Many more deaths now happen outside of the home. So children and younger people are no longer exposed to death and what that means. So the medicalization of death, and also the influence of funeral directors. In fact, traditionally, when someone died, the first person the family would call would be the minister. Currently, for many families, the first person they would call would be the funeral director. So the funeral directors are having quite an impact on the way the rituals are conducted. And although some of them have an eye to heritage, they also have an eye to their profit margin. And so some of the ways in which the rituals are being guided and conducted are commensurate with what will be profitable for the funeral directors, rather than in maintaining the traditional heritage practices.
And so on the one hand, rituals are changing, knowledge, practices changing, and people are concerned, and there are certain things that they want to hang on to because they feel that it's crucial to their identity as Jamaicans. But did everyone agree about what was at stake and what was to be done about it?
There was no, in a word, not everyone agreed, and different people had different solutions as to what could or should be done. The main thing is, what was actually surprising was quite a lot of people thought nothing should be done. Change always happens, and we should allow the change to happen, and it will change organically, and something else will replace it. That view tended to be more reflective of the interviewees in Jamaica, and I think that was because there was a confidence within them that whatever the changes were would still be reflective of Jamaica, whereas in the UK there was a different view that if we lost the practices, they would be lost forever, because we would then be kind of at the mercy, at other cultures, and what those practices would be replaced by would not be Jamaican. So there were these polar opposites in terms of we need to do something to maintain the practices, which was exclusively, not exclusively, but more so in the UK, and more people in Jamaica thought we should allow them to change naturally. It was the solutions also quite marked in the UK. Some were suggesting that we should hold workshops, that we should have the older people teach the younger people. Some suggested that maybe we should take children from the UK to Jamaica to go and observe the practices, not understanding that the practices were also changing in Jamaica. So so there were a number of suggestions, but none of them, there wasn't a clear winner, as it were. There were very different suggestions. However, there was one gentleman whose solution was, he couldn't see a solution that human beings could apply, but he said, the only solution I could see to this was if there was a great plague that affected the whole world, and no one would be able to do all of this flying about. And what he meant by the flying about was that one of the reasons the funerals are extended for such a long time now, why, is because families are waiting for other members to come from other countries to partake in ritual. And he thought that was A, too expensive, and was massively affecting the cost of the rituals, and B, prolonging this time from, up to 8 weeks when someone should already be buried. And his solution was, a great plague that would affect the whole world, and then that wouldn't happen. And I interviewed him, I think, at the end of February. By the 10th of March, Jamaica was in lockdown because of COVID. And indeed, the funerals changed during the time of COVID. All of the rituals did, because no one could go from country to country to attend these events. It also didn't help that the person who they traced COVID to, who first brought it to Jamaica, had come from the UK to attend the funeral. That was a very strange kind of irony. But it's interesting that although the funerals then happened much more quickly, because no one during COVID, because there was no point waiting for anyone, that change hasn't lasted. As soon as the restrictions were lifted, the practices went back to normal. So they're bigger, and they are longer, and which is not surprising in a way if what is at the core of the practices is presence. It makes sense that as many people as possible, or as many of the important people as possible, be there. So the COVID, in some senses, helped to identify what was important.
And so in this sense, the 9-night and the other death rituals, they're both reflective of the experience of being part of the African diaspora and the Jamaican diaspora, and its position in the UK, for instance. Were there any differences between the UK and Jamaica that sort of struck you as distinctive or surprising?
There were a couple of differences. One was in the nature of the rituals that were being lost or at risk of becoming extinct. So in the UK, one of the concerns was that, so the ritual is that the coffin is placed into the grave, and the men, friends and family of the deceased, fill in the grave. And that has been a very contentious issue in the UK of late, because some councils, for health and safety reasons, have been saying that they want to discontinue this practice. And Jamaicans have been fighting tooth and nail to maintain this practice as part of our cultural heritage, as part of an important part of our cultural heritage. But in Jamaica, that ritual is seldom practiced now, because the way the coffin goes into the ground has changed. So in Jamaica, they make far more use of sepulchres than they do in the UK, which means that a structure is built into which the coffin or the casket is inserted, and so there is no need for the men to fill the grave in afterwards. So and in many ways that that change has happened organically in Jamaica. And burial in sepulchres now has become, almost like becoming a traditional part of Jamaican practice, whereas filling in the grave is still being contested here as being very, very important.
So one of the conclusions is that people in Jamaica are somewhat more relaxed about organic processes of change, whereas the Jamaican diaspora in the UK is more anxious about changes because of being embedded in a majority society where perhaps they are under pressure from other cultural influences or a bit marginalized also.
Yes, and in fact, the study was to look at the changes in terms of crisis of heritage and also of national identity. So the second thing was that the issue of national identity was almost non-existent in Jamaica in terms of these losses, whereas it was very prominent in the UK. And the symbols of Jamaican nationality in terms of the flag was reflected in many, many ways within the rituals. So, for instance, you know, at one of the receptions that I went to, all of the decor, all of the colours, with even the lighting was in the Jamaican flag colours. At many of the funerals, those floral tributes were in the colours of the flag. People wore the colours of the flag to the rituals. At one of the Rastafari night that I went to, traditionally at the night, the duppy table, which is a table for the deceased spirit, would be covered in a white tablecloth, but it wasn't. It was covered in a flag of Jamaica. So the fear of a loss of identity because of national identity because of the changes to the rituals is much more prominent in the UK.
Yeah, and so sentiments surrounding Jamaican identity and presence in the UK were expressed in the rituals, and people were concerned. And at pretty much the same time, there's also been a lot of debate surrounding Windrush and the sort of presence and role of Jamaican people in the UK in a longer term perspective. Do you see those two processes intersecting in any way?
Yeah, I mean, in the just I want to just I just wanted to remind myself of how these things intersect. So in terms of the Windrush issue, as it were, when I started this research in 2017, very few people had heard the word Windrush, and I was looking to interview people who had come here on the Windrush, SS Windrush Empire, but also people who had come around that time, but not necessarily on that. In 2018, the whole issue of Windrush kind of blew up in the UK. The changes were already happening to the death rituals, and there were concerns around those, particularly for the older people who would be classed as the Windrush generation, because they are the ones who remembered very clearly how the rituals should be performed. So they already had anxieties around that, loss of heritage and loss of national identity. And then we had the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, which also threw into sharp focus the vulnerability of Black people within white societies. And many of these older people would be in their later years feeling more vulnerable than they did in their younger years. And then we had people being deported back to Jamaica, quite often illegally, to a Jamaica that had changed significantly from when they left it. And one of the issues there in looking at the whole process was there were issues in Jamaica because of the increasing violence, which is a crisis within itself. So I argued that for many of the Jamaicans, particularly the ones in the UK, but not exclusively, because families in Jamaica would be impacted by what was happening to their relatives here, were facing a whole series of crises, which then culminated in a crisis of national identity and a crisis of heritage. But it wasn't everyone, it was certain sectors of the community. So those people who are stronger and more affluent and can weather the changes, they were not experiencing these changes as crises in the same way. But those people who are older and those who are in the lower socioeconomic brackets of society, they were, and I believe they still are experiencing these changes as crises.
So your research really speaks to people's sense of feeling marginalized and concerns about integration, and that also reflects in people's sentiment with respect to individuals. What did your informants think about your results, the insights from your study? Did they find it useful?
I have been amazed at the interest in the work. Beyond the interviewees, and actually some of them have asked to read the thesis, and they have been reading it. I've sent it to them online, and they come back to me, the electronic versions. And one interviewee actually had a hard copy. They've on many levels, I think they see something. They see a piece of research that reflects them, that speaks to their experiences in a way that they have informed. And I was very I was very clear at the outset that I wanted this to reflect the community that I was researching, and tried as much as was possible to maintain that link with the community. Just an aside, my graduation is next week. It's in 6 days' time, and at least 10 or 12 of the interviewees will be coming to the ceremony at the university, because they feel such a part of this that they want to come and be a part of it. So I've also I will just conversations. So there are just general conversations that I will strike up, and people are interested and they want to know more. Another interesting thing for me is that, having discussed the research with others who have not been involved in it at all, I've learned more about some of the protective rituals that I hadn't known about. And people have now volunteering themselves. Oh, you could do a research with me and I'll tell you some more. Come and talk to my dad. He's 87 now, or he's 85 now, and he knows so much. So there are possibilities for gathering even more information in this area, and people are willing, and they're excited about the work. So I've been asked to disseminate it in a number of places. Churches of ministers were involved in the project. I've presented at 2 conferences so far, at the University of Glasgow and the University of De Montfort. I've been asked to be a guest speaker at a support forum for PhD and master students at the University of Birmingham, so to share the work. I'm disseminating via articles, so I've written an article looking at the work through the lens of intersectionality on the health of Black Caribbean women. And I'm writing a book with Rastafari. Well, I say book, but it's probably going to be more of a manual, the Rastafari minister that I interviewed, on how to conduct Rastafari funerals, because that doesn't exist anywhere yet. And I've also been encouraged to publish the findings. So I'm in the process of drafting a book proposal. So I think there is so much interest. There is so much interest in the work. Given it wasn't my first choice, it has been a very happy happenance.
That's a very happy outcome to a research trajectory that's been more marked by adversity and challenges than most. So congratulations, Predencia, and thanks for volunteering for doing this interview. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I hope that others will find it inspiring and maybe take up an interest in doing a PhD of their own. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helle.